Welcome back to the EMD Campus Ministry Podcast. And on this episode, Jordan and I are continuing exploring the lines, the Holy Church Universal, but this time we're really focusing in on the line of the communion of the saints, which has a lot of interesting responses, at least in my experience, because what on earth does that refer to? We know what the word communion is. So is this referring to the sacrament? But if it's referring to the sacrament of communion, then why isn't baptism included in the creed? So that's weird. And then also, who are the saints? Is that everyone, like all Christians? Is it just the Christians who've died? Is it referring to the saints as claimed by the Catholic and Orthodox churches? Like they have saints like St. Andrew, St. Michael, St. Thomas, stuff like that.
The football team in New Orleans. I mean, it could be anybody, really.
Yeah, could be the football team. I mean, you never know. So, what is the communion of saints talking about? And there are various interpretations on this. There's an interpretation that says that it does refer to all those who shared in the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. So, which is a much more universal teaching.
Yeah.
Which refers to not just those who are alive, which we do need to clarify that the communion of saints in this interpretation does not just refer to people who are alive, but also those who have passed on. So, in other words, another way that we put this is the church militant, which is the church that's here, and the church triumphant, which are those who are fully with the Lord. But then also another one that's kind of new to me, which is the church expectant or the church penitent, or I've also heard one, the church suffering. So, Britt, if you want to clarify that part.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Anytime we get the Catholic stuff in defaults to me, I just have a deep appreciation of Catholic theology.
Yeah.
And
you're better at articulating it than I am. So
no, that's not true, but thank you for saying that. So Ben actually kind of touched on the main point, the church suffering, right? This is a theology within certain churches, particularly the Catholic Church, that consists of the Christians that are in the purgatory. Now, if you remember from a couple pods ago, we talked about the resurrection of the body. Ben and I mentioned that there is a little bit of openness in the biblical text about what happens between the time you physically die and what happens when Jesus comes back and the resurrection of the dead happens, right? So the church triumphant in this sense would refer to the resurrection. So the ultimate, the state when evil is conquered and then the earth is made new. But the church expectant or the church suffering or the church penitent, right? Those three phrases have a similarity to them, right? They all imply a similar thing, that the church is giving penance for its wrongs, right? It's becoming redeemed. It's suffering in a sense that the evil that it's done, it's paying for those things, right? And it's expectant in the sense that it's expecting, it is anticipating, it's waiting for the redemption of mankind. So the penitent refers to those that are dead, but not in heaven and triumphant, and that's in that particular sense. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time parsing out, and nor do I feel comfortable or confident enough in my position and my way to articulate it, how that applies to us evangelicals. But just know that you may see that every once in a while if you're really digging into the creeds. And that's what it's referring to when we're talking about the communion of saints, is that anybody who has participated, right, in the sacraments, which means you only participate in the sacraments if you're a Christian, right? You go to church and they do communion. If you're one of the churches that do communion every Sunday, they give you the little disclaimer, hey, if you're not a Christian, we ask that you respectfully don't participate. It's a sacred moment, right? It's a sacrament, sacred sacrament. See how words connect? I know. Awesome stuff, right? But the idea is that anybody who's participated in those is part of the body. And these are the three different places physically, not physically, the three different places that you can be existentially, right? That you can just be, period. Does that make sense, Ben? Do you think that explains what we're getting at?
Yeah, it does, because it clarifies kind of the difference between when we say the Holy Church Universal and the communion of saints, because on the surface they sound very similar when we're articulating, the communion of saints is referring to the connectedness of the body of believers. It's well, didn't we already say that in the claim of the Holy Church Universal? But this is actually, but this is a unique way of stating it, because the Holy Church Universal, if I could be very reductionist, is referring to the unity of believers, as we are from our various backgrounds, from, even our different expressions of the faith, but we're still a unified body of believers. Whereas the communion of saints is referring to the fact that even death does not separate the body of Christ. That even those who have passed on, they are also a part of the church. It's not just those who are alive today. It's those who even passed on, or even those who, from the Catholic perspective, might be in purgatory. Like, they are still a part of the church. Maybe purgatory would be interesting to touch on at some point, because I know that gets a lot of ruffled feathers, and understandably so. It is a bit of can be a very uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it does bring up some interesting questions, and maybe we'll explore that in a little bit. But yeah, the fact that the communion of saints refers to the unified presence of all believers, and I want to emphasize that part too: the unified presence of all believers, living and dead, physically, in worship. So this is something that is articulated, I think, very well in All Saints' Day. And for those who don't know what All Saints' Day is, All Saints' Day is typically, I can't think of a time it hasn't been, but I also have not experienced it long enough to know. But I believe it's the first Sunday in November is All Saints' Day. But I think the actual day on the calendar is like the 6th of November is recognized as All Saints' Day. And it's a day that's set aside in the church year to recognize those who have passed on in the faith, to celebrate their life as believers, the example that they set, but also the fact that they are not absent from us when we are in worship. Because if they are in the presence of the Lord, as we are in the presence of the Lord, then that means that we are in the presence of the Lord together. And even though we can't see them, even though we cannot interact with them in a experiential way, that does not mean that they are totally absent from us, because we are the church. And just as, Christ told Peter, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The death has no authority over the church. It cannot divide the body of Christ, which can be a very awkward thing uh, to grapple with on an intellectual level. Like, how does that actually work? But that's why I always appreciated All Saints Day. Actually, when I was a pastor in Gagetown, I put that into practice. So every year we would have a special ceremony. I would have a tub of sand, and I would invite people to. I had a one candle in the middle that represented Christ, and I would have everyone come forward who has experienced the loss of a loved one who went to be with the Lord. So they lit a candle for that person, and I used that as sort of, a physical example of the fact that, these people are still worshiping with us. So even though they have physically died, they are not truly dead. They still worship with us. And I have actually found that for some people that was incredibly healing. There is one woman I remember who lost her mother that year. And there was another man I knew who lost his mother that year. And so even for that, that was a very special moment for them, because certainly death is something to grieve, and it's evil and it's wicked and it hurts a lot. But to recognize that even though that person is no longer physically with us, but they're not gone for good, and in some way they are still present. Now, I'm not talking about sort of the pseudo spiritual, I don't know what I even want to call it, sort of cultish idea of, well, they're always with us because they live on in our memory. Like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, they are actually still with us, presently in worship as we worship the Lord, which is one reason why Sunday is such a special day for worship. But so that's sort of another articulation of the value of the communion of saints. So I know I went kind of on a tangent there, but
No, no. Can we push the tangent further? Can we go further down this rabbit hole? Because I think there's some really interesting stuff to say.
sure.
So, Ben, I think it's really cool that you did that it's Nazarene evangelical church. I'm just going to say it outright. Evangelicals are not good at talking about this or
Mhm.
thinking about it. And I
Right.
think it's because a lot of us, and this is something that we've been trying to hammer on the pond, um, grow up thinking stuff like, oh, when grandpa dies, his soul goes to heaven. He's up there worshiping God right now. And we've combated some of that, like the way we go about talking about that a little bit.
Mhm.
And it's a comforting, peaceful thought. We think about it like, oh man, they're in peace. Like I'm not saying those things, but what we forget about is that they're still part of the church too, and that they are also awaiting, right, in some sense, the
Yeah.
resurrection, and they will be a body again, and they're
Mhm.
going to explore creation in a new way. And I think the hope there is even more powerful than what we imagine, right? Like they're in the process of participating in God's ultimate redemption, and I think that's really cool. On a personal level, I have almost converted Catholic about 3 or 4 times in my life. Been so close, been so close. A couple things that get me: papal authority. Just a tough one, but it's the thing.
It is a
Gotta
tough
just
hurdle, yeah.
it's a big hurdle. It's a really big hurdle. If you don't know what that is, it means Pope's infallible. It's the executive order stuff I talked about at the beginning or the last pod. The second thing that actually gets me is not even the sacraments. It's actually this. It's the praying to saints and the interactions that we have with the
Mhm.
dead. Um, I don't particularly find it biblical or consistent on the way we talk about using the saints. And I think a lot of Catholics have differing views, which means I think it could be fleshed out a little bit, but it's a big part of the tradition. I've heard people just say like, "Oh, they're just pieces of motivation," and but we can kind of pray to them, we can pray for them, and I get where those are coming
Or
from,
like
and
you
I'm not
pray
trying
for
to
their
demean that.
qualities, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I get that, but um, and I think there's value in finding inspirational people and reading about the saints and learning about the things they do is truly motivating and like empowering to you as a Christian. But in terms of the way we communicate with the dead, that's no. But I think that they really do a good job. The Catholic Church does a good job reminding us that even though they're dead, they're still part of the body,
Mhm.
right? They're just doing it. They're just not actively doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool stuff. So I wanted to push that a little further because I thought we so good. Just really wanted to emphasize that, like, hey, you who's lost a loved one, who's a Christian, is a follower of Jesus Christ, they're awaiting God's return, and they're you know going to actively participate in what we call glory or life everlasting or whatever phrase you want to use, that resurrection, like you are, and that
Mhm.
that is exciting and hopeful to me.
Yeah.
I will get a farm with my grandpa again. I'm excited for that.
Yeah. That's something to look forward to too, is, when we get to see our loved ones again.
The
But you know what?
communion of
I'm actually
saints,
going
literally the communion of
to,
saints.
yeah, I actually want to push that praying to the saints part a little further. Since you
Oh
pushed it,
wow,
I'll push it again too. Um,
it's gonna
I
get out of
that
control.
that's actually an area of Catholicism that I am sympathetic towards, because
Interesting.
I mean, on the one hand, you're right. Like at the very least, it does remind us that those who have died are not fully separated from the body. And I mean like the body of the church. Obviously they're, not in their physical body, but um there is one part of it though that often gets criticized, or at least the reason for its criticism is when people say, "Well, why do I need to ask someone who's died to pray for me when I can just pray to Christ myself?" Which 9 times out of 10 is usually the reason that is given for why praying to the saints is a bad thing, which I find interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I find it interesting because even in that criticism, it acknowledges that those who have died are
Yeah,
conscious in some way. Although some people do argue, well, they're not even awake right now. They're all sleeping. So how could they pray for us? Which we've already talked about how that doesn't make sense. But, well, in some ways doesn't make sense. But it's also interesting because if we want to use that same logic of, well, why would I ask someone who's passed on to pray to the Lord for me on my behalf when I can just pray to God myself? If we want to use that logic, then we should go all the way and say that you should never ask anyone to pray for you because you can just pray to God yourself.
that's fair.
So, like, never give someone else, when people ask for prayer requests, don't say anything. Or you say, no, don't ask for prayer requests because you can just pray to God yourself for that. Like, why is it that here we can go to other people and say, hey, could you pray for me? Why does scripture, really promote that idea and say, no, have people pray for you and pray for other people? Well, why do that when they could just pray to God themselves? And why ask for prayer when I can just pray to God myself? So at least the logic of that argument, I know there are several other arguments, but that one in particular always gets me because it
It
it,
seems
it
half baked.
yeah, it seems half baked, and at the same time, if you want to play the logic a little bit more, you would actually want to pray to someone who's passed on more than you would want someone here to pray for you, because they're actually much more in the presence of the Lord than someone else is. So wouldn't you want them to be praying for you more than somebody else
Interesting.
who might say they're going to pray for you, but then they'll forget because something else comes up, they get distracted. Whereas people who have passed on are far less distracted by the things that we're distracted by. So they would actually pray for you. Um, so that's why I say I'm sympathetic to that, because logically, I I've sort of worked it out and it makes sense to me, and I don't really see, not that no one else has, but personally, I don't see a lot of conflict with that idea. I'm fine with that idea. I don't practice it myself. I've tried at different points, but I think I've sort of shied away because for me it's really awkward because I haven't done it. But from the logical perspective and theologically, I can get behind that idea. Like I don't really see a conflict, but um, I'm
So
not
can
I'm
I?
not. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. You're good. I was gonna offer a. I was gonna clarify my point by also additionally offering a counter perspective,
Yeah.
but not necessarily like telling you you're wrong because I don't know, and that's what I'm actually going to say. Uh, so the reason that I have issues is I agree that argument is hashtag whack. It is not good. I don't like it. 1 out of 10 would not recommend. What other superlative of 2020 can I, or 2019? Because I'm not up to date with 2020. What other dated superlative can I use to say
Uh,
this is not good? Um,
yeah. You're canceled.
so yeah, oh, wow.
Sorry.
Little on the nose. Little on the nose. Um,
Oh boy.
anyway, so wow. The reason for me to not accept the idea of sainthood is because of my views of the resurrection in that intermediate state.
Hmm.
It becomes a difficult hurdle for me because of my honestly lack of knowledge and difficulty trying to decide, and my lack of time to try to find out the answer for what happens between death and the resurrection, right? To
Hmm.
like the debate is to what level of consciousness. In my mind, the debate boils down to what level of consciousness do the people
Hmm.
that have. Now, at no point does their level of consciousness dictate whether they are or they're not part of the body. That's been set in stone, right? That
Hmm.
decision was already made.
Yeah.
It just depends on if they're active or passive. And because I don't affirm purgatory in the traditional sense, I can't affirm the consciousness of a saint. So consequently, praying to a saint is a bit strange of a practice. And I just can't get fully on board with it because I'm skeptical. And because I
Hmm.
can't affirm purgatory and those other beliefs, like this whole practice becomes kind of null and void. But everything you're saying in terms of just like the idea of not asking anybody to pray for you, or furthermore, the idea that these people are actually closer to God. Yeah, no, that's spot on, Ben. And if those purgatory beliefs or like the consciousness of a deceased person before the resurrection is true, then everything you're saying is true because I don't know, and because I'm not willing to take a stance because I don't think it's necessarily the most important theological point or decision I'll make. Um, I just I don't feel like I can commit fully.
Hmm.
That's really where I'm at.
I think that's a much better. No, how do I want to say this? That's a really good position to be on, in
That's an
terms
honest
of.
position.
Well,
It's
yeah, but it.
flawed, I know, but like it's
Yeah,
honest.
but I mean, it does bring up a really valid point, which is a counter to the validity of praying to the saints, because you're right. We don't have that certain affirmation of what state of consciousness and awareness those who have passed on have. So therefore, how can we even know that this is effective? And I think that's a very
Exactly.
valid, like that's a really valid point. Like that's absolutely true. And I think that's why for myself, why I feel so uncomfortable doing it, because in the back of my mind, I'm like, but I don't have that assurance that they're even capable of receiving what I'm saying or what I'm praying, because scripture doesn't speak to it to that level of detail.
Yeah.
um and you're right about that.
So what genuineness could a prayer have?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the idea of when you're questioning God's existence and crying out to him, that's fundamentally different. Is that
Mm.
like I feel like that's a very different conversation than the skepticism of like, hey, is this person awake? Like, I don't deny that they exist. Like, are they physically able to hear me? The idea,
Mhm.
the questioning of God's existence and crying out in frustration, can you hear me? Is a question of a deeper level. Like, hey, is this real? Versus
Mhm.
like, um, if you hear me, depending on your state of consciousness, would you put the good word in with the big man for me? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
don't mean that's so disrespectful and so antithetical to what I'm saying, but I mean it in a playful way, like to illustrate my point. Like, I don't feel like that I would, if I converted Catholic, that would be a practice and some of the
Mhm.
beliefs I'd have to affirm in the confirmation. Uh, it wouldn't be genuine in a real meaningful way. And I think that there's a level of honesty that you have to participate in the church body. And that's something that I just personally can't overcome. So it's
Yeah,
an
because
argument
like,
from ignorance, but it's
mhm.
truth.
Well, I think it makes sense because then you're right. In practice, it would feel like you're just offering a qualified prayer. Like, well, if this is true and this is true and this is true, then this is my prayer.
Provided
Like,
that X, Y, and Z,
yeah.
then would you help
Oh
me get a
boy.
puppy? You know, I don't know. Man, that was
Oh
really
yeah.
mean. I
No, that's
hope
funny.
if you're Catholic and you're listening to this, I like this is not to diminish anything that you believe.
No.
That's not what I'm trying to do. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Uh, Same here. Um, Although I
If
would be
you're
more worried about our Protestant listeners who feel like because we're talking about Catholic stuff, we've like totally gone off the deep end.
no,
Uh,
no, we're trying to actually like really like this is the truth though. I First of all, the American church is grossly miseducated when it comes to church history.
mhm,
And
very true.
and this is because our schools and the way we educate, we separate church and state to the point where like we don't even let teachers talk about it. But like it doesn't become a key part. But like a, a majority of Western European history is, and I mean this in a very real sense, dictated, literally written and dictated by the church, capital
Mhm,
C. Like that is the explanation for a lot of how things happen. And there's a lot of interplay between that and like European politics, and all of that leads to how we get to the US, right? And like think about our early history, right? Like we don't even talk about it deeply in school, like the Puritan movement in the Northeast, you know,
mhm,
like that's really critical stuff. So we're not going off the deep end, I promise, but we're just trying to bring you up to speed because it's not your fault.
mhm.
Your third grade teacher didn't hook you up
Yeah. I mean, if anything else,
because
gives you something
they would have got in
to think
trouble.
about. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
that's fine. Was there anything else actually? So the communion of saints, all of that to say, because we did definitely go on some tangents. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. But really, the communion of saints, it draws our attention to two major points. One major point it draws our attention to is the fact that we are in this together and we should seek unity. As Jordan mentioned before, uh, he touched on this concept. But there was an early phrase when the Church of the Nazarene was starting, and they were borrowing it from Wesley, which I think he even got it from somebody else, which is unity in essentials and liberty in non-essentials, which essentially says, look, in the things that matter, we should be unified, which are those central tenets of the faith. In in all the little details and in how all of that plays out, like let's show grace to one another and not try and demonize one another because like we're on the same team. Kind of like how First Corinthians 12, when Paul talks about the image of the body, that all parts serve one another, that even though those parts look different, even though they function different, but they're all part of the same body. So that's one thing that the communion of saints draws our attention to. And the other one is that we're not alone, and not just in the sense that we are all in this together, but the fact that even the church here is not alone, because like Hebrews 12 points our attention to, like we're joined by a great cloud of witnesses, that there are, that the church is greater than just the church that is here right now in the present, which is encouraging that the church is that universal, not just in geographical space, but even in time, the church is universal. So that's just to summarize what the communion of saints is.
No, I think it's good. I also think it helps to kind of do a little compare contrast. I love compare contrast. It helps me clarify a lot of things um, because it gives me focus on something that I know. So in our last pod, we talked about the Holy Catholic Church, right? So there's a reason these lines are put together closely: the Holy Catholic Church and the Communion of Saints. Now, essentially, we really have talked about almost the same thing twice.
Mhm.
But I'd like to say, to some extent, we're approaching it from different perspectives, which is why the content of the conversation is fundamentally different, right? So think about it this way: it's still the same thing, though. The Holy Catholic Church, right, Holy Universal Church, is talking like top down, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example. Oh, here's a good example. Uh, Ben works for the Eastern Michigan District, so we're going to talk about the Eastern Michigan District, right,
Okay.
and the ministry that they do. Now they cover a big broad field, right? That's big, but Ben is one small part. He's a member of the Eastern Michigan District, as well as, I don't know, Ben, can you name another colleague that works on the EMD with you?
Uh, Pastor Jeff Crowder.
Shout out to Jeff Crowder. So on the, yeah, I mean that playfully. So like they're both part of the Eastern Michigan District, right? Now we can talk about the ministry of Pastor Jeff Crowder and Ben and how they interplay, right?
Mhm.
But that's encapsulated in the broader spectrum of Eastern Michigan District. Now apply that line of thinking to the Holy Catholic Church, right? So it's top down, it's a big idea. So the Holy Catholic Church is all Christians, right? ALL, all caps, right? Bold, underlined, italicized. It
Mhm.
is everybody who affirms the creed that is a follower of Jesus. We talked about defining those lines, which is why in the pod we define the lines of what it means to be part of the church, right? And what is and what is not. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the idea of the Holy Catholic Church. So contrast that to the Communion of Saints, which is a different discussion. This is a conversation that starts boots on the ground. So it'd be like talking about Ben and saying, "Hey Ben, where do you work?" "Well, I work for this organization, which is part of the Eastern Michigan District." You know what I mean? Like, and you work your
Mhm.
way up inductively, right? It's like little to big. So it's going the opposite direction. Finding out a little bit to get to more. So that's why we're talking about to what extent the believers within the body, right, can communicate, like how they communicate, what kind of relationship they have, what the level of consciousness is after death, and all those things like that, right? But that's all within the umbrella of the Holy Catholic Church because we're affirming that they're all part of it, but we're just talking about the interaction, right? It's ground level.